So we decided someday wasn't a day of the week, and before we knew it, we were flying across the ocean in order to explore 4 countries in Europe. Our first destination was Vienna, Austria, where we would spend 3 days doing lots of walking, getting lost a few times, seeing historic and modern parts of the city, discovering foodie delights on the Austrian food scene, and jumping into a very different world of schedules, sights, and sounds. Thanks for joining in on the adventure. Alright, our first morning in Vienna. We're having leftovers for breakfast and enjoying our tiny little kitchen apartment with the YWAM peoples and admiring all of the travel size stuff. Itty bitty. The first day on the ground was our adjustment day. We had purchased Vienna passes, but we wouldn't activate them until the second day. Today would be a day for getting the lay of the land and for enjoying the city without too much time pressure. To start off our morning, we enjoyed browsing a selection of fresh flowers and plants at a local flower shop that was on the square and taking in the architecture that was all around us. Continuing on through Stephansplatz, we popped in our earbuds and began listening to Rick Steves as we took his recommended walking tour through historic Vienna, or at least we thought we were taking the recommended walking tour. Not once, but twice, we started the tour in the wrong direction, and several minutes later began to wonder why nothing that was being described seemed to be before our eyes. We did get to explore a few random side streets though, and came across a scrumptious Kassakleiner in the process, so maybe it was worth it. After lunch, we did some window shopping around Stephansplatz. We also stepped into a cheese shop that was filled with all kinds and flavors of cheese. I think that was our favorite shop in Vienna. After getting back on track with the walking tour, for real this time, we came across an advertisement for a performance of The Sound of Music and decided to purchase a set of tickets. Who knew if we would understand a thing that was said, but it would be a cultural experience, so we went with it. We toured around a few different markets and squares and viewed the famous churches and museums from the outside before walking down the Graben, which is a main thoroughfare filled with shops, people, musicians, carriages, and outdoor eateries. The tour officially ended at the Hofburg, but we decided for us the tour would end at Demel, one of Vienna's famous chocolate shops that also serves several kinds of Kaffee und Kuchen, or coffee and cake. Demel was packed with visitors when we were there, as it is a touristy stop, but a gentleman who was finishing his coffee was kind enough to give us his table. We were grateful. Back on the Graben, we enjoyed having opportunity to listen to one of the street musicians who had set up along the thoroughfare. We found there to be many opportunities to enjoy live performances on the streets and in the extensive underground train passages throughout our trip in Europe. Oftentimes, they would play the melody on their instrument of choice and have a background track playing the accompaniment. Next up was a new and exciting cultural challenge, taking on a European supermarket. This particular market had 2 stories, and its shelves were filled with fresh vegetables and fruits, traditional breads and pastries, a plethora of yogurts, cheeses, meats, salts, teas, etc., etc.
Raspberry.
Raspberry's fine. We enjoyed perusing all of the options, but did find it rather overwhelming. Not to mention the feeling of claustrophobia while trying to manage our basket, phones, and camera. But we survived and returned to our lodging bearing several new food treasures.
On our way to Sound of Music, the underground. Hold on. Here we are at the Sound of Music, listening to it in German. What do you think, Emily?
So that we can actually understand those a bit. Because the English subtitles can't agree, but you know.
Even though 98% of the production was in German and Do Re Mi turned into ABC, the Sound of Music performance was a great experience. If ever given opportunity to see the Austrian version of the Sound of Music, we highly recommend it.
Here we are, our late night snack at no other than Burger King. In Vienna, with the fancy ceilings and the restrooms that charge. But they have some interesting looking desserts. We had to pay for ketchup, except we didn't get ketchup.
At the end of this day, I described it as a day for the education of American travelers. And it was one for being bussed all over the city, getting quite turned around, changing the plan a few dozen times, and unintentionally seeing a good bit of the modern parts of the city instead of the historic side. This was not quite the goal for the day, but we learned from the experience and realized there's always these kinds of days when traveling, right? Gotta learn to roll with it. After barely avoiding being caught in the middle of an altercation at the bus stop, we landed on the top floor of a Viennese tour bus. From there, we had a great vantage point for seeing the sights and following along with our audio guide. By noon, we made it out to the St. Francis of Assisi Church, also known as the Mexico Church, built between 1898 and 1910. It is an architectural feat in the midst of the modern part of Vienna. Though we expected to be able to see it and move on quickly to the next part of the day, we ended up shopping for a bite of lunch and then walking for about a mile and asking for directions in order to find the closest train station. Again, it was a learning day. Once returned to the interior of the Ringstrasse, it was time to tour the Hofburg. Our Vienna passes gave us entry to several different parts of the palace, and once we learned the lay of the land and stowed our bags in the cloakroom, we began our perusal of all things royalty. Inside the Hofburg Palace, you can tour the royal apartments, the treasury, and so on. And oftentimes, there are numbered audio guides that explain exactly what you're looking at and its importance to the royalty in days gone by. Because there were a few schedule hiccups earlier in the day, we did have to rush through the tour much faster than we would have liked. If you are in Vienna and interested in touring the palace, be sure to plan for at least 2 to 3 hours for the interior alone. Stepping away from the luxury and grandeur of the Hofburg, we exited into the sunshine and fresh air. Here we enjoyed spending a few minutes in one of Vienna's beautiful and less populated squares before taking the underground and power walking to a river port for an evening cruise on the Danube. We had attempted to stop there on our bus tour that morning, but unfortunately blew right past it alongside other tourists who wanted to cruise as well. We were able to obtain our tickets seconds before they closed the office doors and boarded the small cruise ship. Somehow we managed to claim 2 spots on the deck outside amidst the crowd and set off down the river, or up the river depending on how you look at it. We were sad that the boat we took went towards the modern side of the city, as we had seen a good bit of it earlier in the day, but having half an hour to relax wasn't a bad thing either. There's a funny little story about trying to find a schnitzel restaurant and ending up at an Italian place instead, in between the cruise and our next destination. But suffice it to say, we did get to try schnitzel before leaving Austria, and the Italian food was rather tasty. And speaking of tasty, our late night dessert stop was at the Café Schwarzenberg, where I had an ice chocolat, and my mom tried to find something with whipped topping. Hard thing to find in Austria, we discovered. We also decided on a slice of cake after much capitulation. Also a part of the evening's activities was watching a snippet of an opera that was streamed live outside of the opera house. It was sort of difficult to follow, but I appreciated having opportunity to participate for a time in an opera live on Platz. Day 3 in Vienna found us taking the underground to Schönbrunn. The palace is not too far from Stephansplatz, and it is surprisingly surrounded by city. If you want to visit Schönbrunn while in Vienna, note that there is more than one station that you can stop at. In other words, if you get off at the first station, you may have to walk around looking for a glimpse of yellow to figure out where the palace is.
They just let us walk in, but there's gotta be a probably window like it.
After touring the inside of the royal apartments, the gardens and grounds were calling, and we enjoyed stepping out to admire the greenery and mathematically designed landscapes. Schönbrunn literally means beautiful spring, and it felt like spring even at the beginning of the fall when we were there. Around 3 million people visit Schönbrunn Palace each year, but thankfully it was not overly crowded when we visited. The Privy Garden, where we spent several minutes, was quite sparsely populated with tourists, which added to its calming effect. There are 435 acres of property associated with the palace, and each quadrant is unique, from a private zoo and shrubbery maze to an expansive rose garden and giant greenhouses that feature all kinds of foreign plants. It's quite impressive.
So we made it to, this is not July, where is this?
Yes. Schönbrunn. We're now in the gardens. Emily thinks we're walking in the midst of poison ivy. It's probably just garden ivy.
Looks just like poison ivy.
Having listened to the story of Emperor Franz Josef and his wife at the Hofburg, we realized that we should have dedicated all of our time to the outdoors here, rather than splitting it between the inside and outside, though the inside tour was still interesting. If visiting Vienna and using the Vienna Pass, we do recommend spending time in the regal interior of the Hofburg Palace and the expansive exterior of the Schönbrunn. A fun event at the palace that was included on the Vienna Pass was the apple strudel show. It was short but informative and tasty. The show was in German and English, and it was impressive to listen to the seamless transition between the two languages, all spoken by one person.
But we do not cook them, so we have some pieces that stay crunchy. And we put it on the middle of the glass. Vi nehmen jetzt den Teig und wir legen ihn in die Mitte des Tuches. So that we here. So ich würde gerne anfangen, den Teig in die Höhe zu werfen. Warum nicht?
The little panorama train was of assistance in making our way to the top of the estate without abusing our sandaled feet. There we found the Gloriette, a crowning touch to the Baroque ensemble at Schönbrunn. There's a little cafe inside, but the view is really what makes this spot so special. The Gloriette offers a splendid vista of the palace and most of Vienna. There really is much to explore at the Schönbrunn, and it was unfortunate we didn't have more time there. Though we covered a good bit of the estate, we likely only saw about 40% of what is there. On our way out, we did get to enjoy the rose garden and view more beautiful plants and flowers near the Palmenhaus, a greenhouse with different climatic zones for its plant residents. And it was a lovely way to finish off our tour of the Schönbrunn. Oh, and that pastry food stall right inside the gate.
All right,
Ready?
here comes. Yes, go ahead.
How do you say this thing again?
Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's an apricot donut thingy. I don't know what it's called.
And the Lindt chocolate store.
Mama is in chocolate heaven.
Mama, chocolate. Mama, chocolate.
There was one last stop for us before leaving Vienna, the Naschmarkt. The Naschmarkt is a market with historic origins that is filled with all kinds of food, trinkets, and postcards. If you can make it past the trinkets, the repeat stands, and crush of the crowd, it is a fascinating little spot in the city. You may have to haggle a bit with the vendors, but it's worth it just for the cultural experience. We enjoyed our berek mit käse, falafel, and baklava while listening to a local band and watching the passers-by. Somehow, we had already spent 3 days in Vienna, and it was time to say Auf Wiedersehen and set off for our next destination, Salzburg, the city of music.